Want to know what genuinely tortures a narcissist? Not your rage, not your tears, not your lengthy paragraph laying out everything they did wrong. The thing they dread most is becoming emotionally irrelevant to you. Today, you will discover 4 psychological shifts that can completely disrupt the narcissistic playbook, and not a single one of them requires revenge, conflict, or proving your value, because the greatest disturbance to manipulation is a person who no longer performs on cue. Quick question. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling confused, guilty, completely drained, and somehow responsible for a problem you never created in the first place? If yes, you are absolutely not alone. And by the time you finish reading this, you may begin to recognize why certain responses keep you stuck while others quietly transform the entire dynamic around you. When people hear the phrase, "stop providing emotional access," they frequently misunderstand what it actually means. They assume it means becoming cold, withdrawn, silent, or emotionally unavailable to every person in their life. That is not what this is about at all. It means becoming intentional and deliberate about who receives access to your inner world, especially when you are dealing with someone who repeatedly uses your emotions as a tool for control, confusion, or manipulation. In unhealthy dynamics, emotional access quietly becomes an open door that swings both ways, but only benefits one person. Your fears, your hopes, your insecurities, your frustrations, and even your dreams become information that can be used strategically against you. You share pain while seeking genuine comfort and instead receive harsh criticism. You express valid concerns while seeking real understanding and instead receive blame and deflection. Over time, you may begin to notice that honest emotional expression does not actually create closeness or safety. It creates vulnerability without protection. This is precisely where so many people become deeply trapped. They continue explaining, clarifying, defending, and sometimes even pleading, genuinely believing that if they just communicate more clearly or more thoroughly, empathy will eventually appear on the other side. But endless explanation can quietly become emotional overexposure. Every reaction you offer provides more raw material to debate, dismiss, distort, or weaponize at a later moment. Reducing emotional access is not about pretending you feel nothing. It is about recognizing that genuine emotional openness requires a foundation of trustworthiness on both sides. You stop narrating every internal struggle to someone who has consistently mishandled your reality. You stop responding to every single provocation as though it demands an immediate emotional performance from you. Not every accusation you receive deserves a detailed defense. Not every misunderstanding requires a 5-page explanation that leaves you more exhausted than when you started. You may choose to answer calmly rather than reactively. You may choose brevity over emotional flooding. You may notice the familiar urge to prove your goodness, your innocence, or your intentions, and consciously decide not to step into a cycle that has never once led to genuine resolution. This can feel deeply uncomfortable at first, because so many people have been conditioned over time to believe that withholding emotional access is somehow rude, selfish, or a sign of not caring enough. In reality, healthy emotional boundaries are not punishments handed out in retaliation. They are filters. They help you distinguish clearly between people who genuinely seek connection and people who are quietly seeking leverage over your nervous system. Emotional access is valuable, and the moment you begin treating it as something valuable, the entire dynamic around you starts to shift in ways you may not have expected. Becoming uninteresting to someone's drama does not mean becoming passive, weak, or indifferent to behavior that is genuinely harmful to you. It means refusing to function as emotional fuel for cycles specifically designed to generate confusion, urgency, and constant reaction from you. In many unhealthy dynamics, conflict is not always genuinely about solving problems or reaching mutual understanding. Sometimes it is entirely about maintaining emotional control, keeping your attention locked onto tension, unpredictability, and never-ending emotional engagement that drains you while energizing the other person. Drama often survives and thrives through active participation. The argument expands and intensifies because every accusation receives a defense. Every provocation receives a charged emotional response. Every confusing or contradictory statement launches a long and exhausting effort to restore logic to a conversation that was never actually operating from a place of mutual understanding or good faith. People become trapped in the cycle of trying to win clarity from deliberate chaos. They replay conversations late into the night, overanalyze subtle tone shifts, frantically defend their intentions, and endlessly search for the perfect explanation that will finally make everything fall into place and make sense. But drama frequently loses its energy and momentum when the expected reaction simply does not arrive as scheduled. This does not mean you ignore genuinely important issues or suppress feelings that deserve acknowledgement. It means you become significantly more deliberate about where your emotional energy is directed. Instead of responding impulsively to criticism, guilt tactics, deliberate baiting, or manufactured crisis, you slow yourself down. You address the actual issue at hand without stepping directly into emotional escalation. You stop treating every emotional ambush like an emergency that requires your immediate attention, your nervous system, and your hard-earned peace of mind. This shift can feel profoundly unnatural when you first begin practicing it. Many people have been deeply conditioned to believe that calm responses mean they are somehow failing to adequately defend themselves. They fear that if they do not explain thoroughly enough, react visibly enough, or fight hard enough, they will appear guilty, indifferent, or weak to those watching. But constant and relentless engagement does not always create resolution or understanding. Sometimes it simply extends the exhaustion and keeps the unhealthy pattern breathing. Becoming uninteresting to drama means deliberately reducing the reward structure that keeps unhealthy behavioral patterns alive and repeating. Fewer emotional speeches delivered in moments of frustration. Fewer circular arguments that consume hours without producing resolution. Fewer attempts to force genuine accountability from someone deeply committed to misunderstanding, denial, or ongoing conflict maintenance. Your responses gradually become clearer, shorter, steadier, and far less emotionally negotiable than they once were. The focus slowly and meaningfully shifts from constantly managing another person's emotional storms to intentionally managing your own energy, your own attention, and your own behavioral choices in every interaction. Building a life that does not revolve around them is often one of the most psychologically difficult shifts to make, because unhealthy dynamics have a particularly insidious way of quietly becoming the absolute center of your emotional universe without you ever consciously choosing for that to happen. It rarely occurs all at once in a single dramatic moment. It develops gradually and almost invisibly over time. You begin monitoring moods carefully. You start adjusting your behavior constantly to avoid triggering conflict. You find yourself replaying conversations from days ago, anticipating reactions before they happen, and unconsciously organizing your entire day around maintaining a fragile sense of stability in the relationship. Without ever fully realizing it, your mental and emotional energy becomes completely consumed by prediction, damage control, and constant emotional management of someone else's experience. In these kinds of situations, your own life begins shrinking in subtle but significant ways. Hobbies that once brought you real joy slowly lose their importance. Friendships that once nourished you begin receiving far less of your attention and investment. Personal goals that once excited you get quietly postponed until the conditions feel right, which they never quite do. Rest starts to feel undeserved and selfish. Joy becomes conditional on whether the relationship is currently calm, temporarily approving, or in one of its peaceful phases. You may begin measuring your emotional state entirely according to their behavior rather than according to your own values, your own routines, or your own internal sense of direction and purpose. Building a life outside that orbit is not about making dramatic declarations or forcing a sudden and jarring emotional detachment. It is about slowly and steadily reestablishing yourself as a full person whose identity genuinely extends beyond the dynamic you have been caught inside. You reconnect with interests and passions that belong to you alone, not to the relationship or to what the other person approves of. You rebuild daily routines that actively support your physical, emotional, intellectual, and creative well-being in concrete and meaningful ways. You invest your time in work that fulfills you, in learning that excites you, in friendships that replenish you, in spirituality, in health, or in meaningful pursuits that remind you consistently that your existence is far larger and more significant than one person's approval, one person's criticism, one person's unpredictability, or one person's emotional demands placed upon you. This process can feel surprisingly and genuinely uncomfortable when you first begin moving through it. Many people discover that they have become so deeply accustomed to hyper-focusing on another person's behavior and reactions that turning their attention back toward themselves suddenly creates feelings of guilt, anxiety, or even an unexpected inner emptiness. You may feel selfish for beginning to prioritize your own goals and needs. You may begin to anticipate conflict the moment you become less available, less reactive, or less centered around managing someone else's emotional landscape and inner turmoil. But reclaiming your own life fundamentally changes the balance of power within the dynamic. Your world gradually becomes broader and more textured. Your sense of identity becomes more stable and more clearly defined. Your emotional resources are no longer concentrated entirely within a single relationship pattern that consistently depletes rather than replenishes you. The more deeply connected you become to your own purpose, your own structure, your own community, and your own inner direction, the less power unhealthy dynamics tend to hold over your sense of self, your attention, and the quality of your daily experience. Releasing the need for someone to openly admit what they did to you can honestly be one of the most difficult emotional shifts a person ever has to make, because the desire for genuine acknowledgement is deeply and profoundly human. When you have been hurt, dismissed, manipulated, or repeatedly misunderstood by someone who claimed to care about you, you naturally and reasonably want confirmation that what you experienced was real and that it mattered. You want honesty from them. You want genuine accountability. You want the enormous relief that comes from hearing someone look you in the eye and clearly say, "Yes, I did that. I understand the full impact of what I did, and I take complete responsibility for it." That desire is entirely understandable and valid, because acknowledgement has always felt deeply connected to justice, to closure, and to the emotional resolution that allows healing to genuinely begin. The real difficulty arises at the moment when your healing becomes entirely dependent upon a person who may be fundamentally unwilling, genuinely unable, or completely uninterested in ever providing that acknowledgement to you. When your peace remains tied to a confession or an apology that may never arrive in the form you need, the person who caused the wound continues to hold significant power over your recovery, your present emotional state, and your ability to move forward into a life that is fully your own. Here is your script with slightly changed wording, no headings, same structure, and well above 9,000 characters. Many people find themselves caught in an exhausting cycle of attempting to receive validation from the very source of their confusion or suffering. They collect evidence, return to old conversations, explain how things made them feel, highlight recurring patterns, and search for the precise combination of words that will finally generate genuine understanding. But when denial, defensiveness, blame shifting, minimization, or the distortion of reality become consistent and predictable behaviors, the pursuit of acknowledgement can turn into something emotionally draining and all-consuming. This does not mean that accountability no longer carries weight or significance. It means learning to recognize the important difference between genuinely valuing accountability and making your entire recovery dependent on actually receiving it. Your experience does not become worthless or invalid simply because another person refuses to acknowledge it. Your perception does not lose its legitimacy just because someone chooses to deny it, reframe it, or rewrite what actually took place. Waiting endlessly for validation from an untrustworthy or unreliable source can slowly hand over your emotional stability to someone else entirely. Releasing the need for admission is not about pretending that harm never happened or that nothing was ever done wrong. It is about learning to trust your own observations, your own memories, your emotional responses, and the patterns you have witnessed play out repeatedly over time. You stop treating another person's agreement as the final and absolute authority on what your reality actually is. You may still desire honesty, real consequences, or meaningful accountability from the other person, but your capacity to move forward is no longer permanently suspended while you wait for someone else to decide to offer those things. Your clarity begins to depend less on confirmation from outside yourself and more on your own willingness to recognize and accept what you already understand deep down. If any part of this is resonating with you right now, take a moment and leave a single word in the comments. Just the word boundaries. Not because writing that one word resolves everything immediately, but because naming the shift you want to make is sometimes the very first step toward actually beginning to practice it. And if you are getting something meaningful from this, keep watching, because the fourth point ahead completely changes the way you will understand personal power. Emotional detachment through internal validation means that you gradually reclaim authority over your own emotional reality rather than continuously outsourcing it to another person's reactions, their approval, or the way they choose to interpret things. In many controlling or emotionally unstable relational patterns, people unknowingly train themselves over time to measure truth through the responses they get from others. When the other person agrees, they feel justified and certain. When the other person denies what happened, they feel disoriented and confused. When the other person responds with anger, dismissiveness, or indifference, they begin to question their own perception entirely and wonder if they are the problem. Over time, this builds a form of psychological dependency where internal certainty gradually weakens and outside feedback becomes the main reference point through which a person understands their own reality. Internal validation works to reverse that entire structure. It does not mean shutting yourself off from the perspectives of others or becoming completely inflexible in the way you think. It means building the genuine ability to hold your own experience as valid even in the complete absence of another person's agreement. You learn to notice what you were feeling in a particular moment, what you directly observed with your own eyes, and how your body and your emotions responded without immediately handing the interpretation of those things over to someone else. This becomes especially critical in situations where communication patterns are inconsistent and unpredictable, where language is deliberately used to distort rather than to genuinely clarify, or where conversations repeatedly end in greater confusion rather than any real sense of resolution or peace. As this internal shift begins to take shape, emotional intensity naturally starts to decline because you are no longer endlessly seeking confirmation from someone who is either unwilling or unable to provide it honestly. You stop entering those long and exhausting cycles of explanation where you are essentially trying to convince another person that your reality is real. Instead, you begin asking yourself internally whether something genuinely feels consistent, whether it feels respectful, and whether it aligns with the values you actually hold. That internal reference point gradually becomes more powerful than any external reaction could ever be. Over time, this steady process reduces emotional dependency and builds real psychological stability. You are less easily drawn into arguments that serve no productive purpose, less shaken when someone denies or contradicts what you know to be true, and far less likely to abandon your own understanding of events simply to maintain a fragile and temporary sense of peace. The focus moves away from being understood by other people and toward understanding yourself with enough depth and honesty that being misunderstood by others no longer has the power to destabilize your foundation. Breaking emotional conditioning requires first recognizing that many of the reactions you experience inside difficult dynamics are not fully conscious or deliberate choices. They are learned responses that were shaped and reinforced over a long period of time through consistent repetition. When someone repeatedly uses criticism, emotional withdrawal, guilt, or deliberate confusion as tools in their interactions with you, your nervous system begins to anticipate those patterns and prepares itself for them automatically without you consciously directing it to do so. You may find yourself reacting quickly to subtle shifts in tone, over-explaining yourself when you feel accused of something, shutting down or freezing during moments of conflict, or feeling personally responsible for stabilizing an emotional environment that was never actually yours to manage. These are not signs that something is fundamentally broken or weak in you. They are unmistakable signs of adaptation to prolonged and ongoing emotional unpredictability. The process of genuine change begins the moment you start noticing the space between something triggering you and the reaction that follows. Rather than immediately responding in order to provoke, defend yourself, or rush to repair the situation, you pause long enough to honestly recognize what is actually taking place within you. That pause is precisely where old conditioning begins to lose its hold. You start to see clearly that not every statement directed at you requires your engagement, not every spike of emotion requires your full participation, and not every uncomfortable silence needs to be filled with explanation, justification, or reassurance given to the other person. Over time, this creates an entirely new internal pattern within you. Your body and nervous system begin learning that a feeling of urgency does not always signal genuine danger, and that the presence of discomfort does not always demand an immediate response or action. You begin selecting your responses based on actual clarity rather than automatic reflex. This shift is subtle in how it begins, but it is genuinely powerful in what it produces, because it interrupts the automatic loops that keep emotional dynamics in a state of constant instability. As this development continues, you may find that conversations which once felt completely overwhelming become noticeably easier to move through. The emotional charge surrounding them decreases, not necessarily because the external situation has changed, but because your internal system is no longer fully controlled by it. You become less reactive overall, more capable of observing what is happening around you, and far more deliberate and intentional with where you invest your emotional energy. Rather than being pulled helplessly into familiar destructive cycles, you begin recognizing them much earlier and stepping away from them before they have the chance to fully escalate, which over time and with consistency gradually reshapes the entire dynamic from the inside out. Reality anchoring is the deliberate and consistent practice of grounding your understanding of events, emotions, and lived experiences in observable patterns rather than in the constantly shifting interpretations being offered to you by someone else. In difficult relational dynamics, particularly those involving manipulation, persistent denial, or ongoing invalidation, one of the most serious and lasting effects is not simply emotional pain and distress, but a deeper cognitive disorientation that accumulates quietly. You begin to second guess what was actually said in a conversation, what was genuinely meant by it, and even what you yourself felt in the moment it was happening. Over a significant period of time, this erosion can severely weaken your ability to trust your own perception of reality, which makes you increasingly dependent on external explanations and narratives to make sense of your own experience. Reality anchoring interrupts that slow and damaging drift by helping you return deliberately to concrete and reliable reference points. Rather than following changing narratives wherever they lead, you focus your attention on what remains consistent, what was said repeatedly across many different interactions, what specific behaviors occurred over an extended period of time, what emotional impact consistently followed those interactions without exception. This does not demand an obsession with cataloging every minor detail or endlessly replaying past moments in your mind, but it does require that you honestly acknowledge patterns rather than treating every instance as an isolated and unconnected event. When reality is fragmented into individual isolated incidents, it becomes far easier for someone to confuse, reinterpret, or dismiss. When it is viewed clearly as a pattern of behavior across time, clarity becomes much more stable and reliable. This practice also means learning to resist the immediate impulse to overwrite your own experience the moment it is challenged by someone else. In many unhealthy and unbalanced dynamics, the other person may confidently deny, reframe, or minimize something that you know with certainty you experienced. Without anchoring, that contradiction creates immediate internal conflict and leads you to doubt yourself in the very moment it is occurring. With anchoring firmly in place, you are able to hold both perspectives in your awareness simultaneously without surrendering your own internal reference point to someone else's version of events. Over time, this practice consistently strengthens psychological stability in profound ways. You begin trusting your memory, your emotional responses, and your perception of repeated patterns more than you trust external reinterpretations offered by others. You become less vulnerable to tactics designed to create confusion, less dependent on receiving outside reassurance to feel certain, and far less willing to abandon your own honest understanding of things simply to reduce tension in the moment. Reality anchoring ultimately restores a deep and durable sense of internal consistency, one where your experience remains genuinely valid and meaningful, even when it is not reflected back to you or acknowledged by the people involved.